Salam Al-Marayati, President, Muslim Public Affairs Council. ISIS is a violent extremist group that is based out of the Middle East. Unfortunately, it's the byproduct of poor policy in the region by the West and bad ideology by governments in the Middle East. And the combination, therefore, has resulted in the rise of groups like ISIS. What ISIS does is use Islam as a means to attract people, as if it's working for Islam, but anytime you kill innocent human beings, anytime you are cruel, then that is not Islam. Islam stands for peace. ISIS stands for violence. Islam stands for engagement. ISIS stands for destructive confrontation. Islam stands for justice. ISIS stands for cruelty and injustice. So even though they use the name Islam in their title, it's anything but Islam. And many reasons why you have American Muslims living here as opposed to the Middle East is because we fled persecution from groups like ISIS and tyrants in the Middle East. The biggest problem that we have in terms of the impact of ISIS on American Muslims is the way American media reports on ISIS. It pays attention more to ISIS than it does to American Muslims. It gives credibility to ISIS by reacting and replaying all the videos that ISIS wants us to see. The brutality of beheadings, for example, the statements made against non-Muslims, the treatment of women. And unfortunately, the reality is that that's a fraction of what's happening in the Muslim world, and definitely it is alien to the American Muslim culture, but ISIS is given more relevance than American Muslims. And so part of the reality that we have to deal with is to change the perceptions. The perception is that ISIS is irrelevant to what Islam is irrelevant to what American Muslims are doing, yet it is given more relevance by our media. We have to give relevance to the vast majority of the Muslim world, and these are the law-abiding, peaceful Muslim communities throughout the world, and definitely the American Muslim community. And by doing that, we will be more effective in counterterrorism policy, and we will remove the stigmatization of American Muslims, and always dealing with the post-9/11 identity, obviously, is very stigmatizing to young American Muslims. If I were to talk to a person who's thinking about going down that path of extremism and violence, I would have, number one, I would have a personal talk to see what is causing that behavior, what is triggering that idea. And then we would talk about what's happening in the community. We talk about Islam. I would tell that person what Islam actually says, and hopefully I will be able to clarify what Islam is from what ISIS is actually doing or saying, and that's the exploitation of Islam to get young people to go and die while the leaders of ISIS sit on empty thrones of self-righteousness. You know, what's interesting is that ISIS usually doesn't use religion that much. It uses religion as sort of a veneer, but its main driver is politics. What it is saying is that the people of the Middle East have been occupied and colonized by the West since Napoleon, and that Western powers after World War I divided the Middle East arbitrarily to serve Western interests and keep the Muslims and the Arabs divided. So it is a political discussion that is involved when a person is considering joining ISIS. And ISIS is saying, come to us, you will not be humiliated. Islam is not only respected, it will be cherished, it will be honored. The West hates Islam. The West is at war with Islam. So we have to deal with that narrative, with the West at war with Islam, and provide the counter-narrative to that. That's the politics that we have to discuss with anyone considering joining ISIS. terms of the status of ISIS in the Middle East right now, unfortunately, it has captured a major city, Mosul, in northern Iraq. It has been able to spread throughout parts of Syria and Iraq, very close to Baghdad, in fact. And so, like a Gulf sheikdom that has one city as part of the state, ISIS is comparable to that. It is still weak economically compared to other states in the region. But the fact that it has been able to capture and develop a base out of Mosul in northern Iraq is very troubling. It's very disturbing. And that's why we say you cannot get rid of ISIS through war. You cannot deal with ISIS militarily. You cannot bomb ideas out of people who may think that going to something called the Islamic State is good for them. You have to deal with bad ideas with good ideas. Bad ideology with good theology. And so we have to deal with the reality that ISIS exists, and that if there's only going to be more war and military actions against ISIS and heavy-handed law enforcement here in the US, then the reality is more groups like ISIS are going to rise up from the ashes of war. Just like Hamas had arisen from the 1988 Intifada, and Hezbollah had arisen from the ashes of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, unfortunately, other groups are going to rise up if all we see in the Middle East is more war. ISIS is using the term khilafah, or the caliphate, and saying that they are now bringing back the Islamic State to the region. The Islamic State had existed for centuries, and the last reigning power for the Islamic State were the Ottomans, and it was dismantled after World War I in 1917. And so ISIS is saying they're going back to the Islamic State, and for Muslims to make immigration, or as very similar to what Israel is saying, come back, do the aliyah, or immigrate to Israel. They're calling Muslims to immigrate to ISIS. The hollowness of that, though, is so stark. In other words, ISIS is not a state. It is not following Islam. It is a lie that it is promoting to lure people in, because once young people get there, the living conditions are terrible. Women are treated as sex slaves, and really all you're told to do is to go and have war. It is a miserable condition. I compare that to a movie I saw one time when I was young called Reds, with Warren Beatty, when he was lured to go to Russia thinking he was going to find communism, and then he realized the corruption, the exploitation, the hollowness of what communists were actually saying and with what they're actually doing. I think ISIS is fairly similar. Unfortunately, it's much more brutal now than ever before. Well, we have a number of programs dealing with recruiting by ISIS of young American Muslims, usually young American Muslim males. It really hasn't happened that often. It is rare that it does happen. But in those rare occasions, on those rare occasions, we have to be ready for the next person who might be recruited by ISIS. And so we have what we call the Safe Spaces Initiative, and it's based on prevention and intervention. Prevention simply means for those young people that want to be involved in causes, let our community provide opportunities for young people to embrace causes, because if you don't give them any causes to embrace, they will go and find other causes like ISIS, like joining gangs, or they'll suffer from addictive behavior because of depression. So let us deal with that by offering opportunities, by also clarifying good theology of Islam from bad ideology of ISIS. Number two is intervention. In other words, when we see somebody that is going down the path of violence, let us intervene and not turn away, or turn that person away from the community. In the case of Boston, Tamerlan Tsarnaev was turned away by the mosque because of his erratic behavior. That's understandable, that's even justifiable, because the mosque doesn't want to deal with trouble. So the mosque has to provide resources to people so that they can embrace causes that are constructive, that reach solutions, at least for them personally, in terms of how they see the world. They see the world where Muslims are being attacked and humiliated all the time. They want to see a world where Muslims receive justice. Well, let's give them that opportunity for Muslims to achieve justice in a peaceful, constructive way. Secondly, the government has to provide a safe harbor for us to intervene in cases where somebody is thinking about going down the path of violent extremism. If the imam or the community leader or the mentor is going to be viewed with suspicion and possibly indicted because he is intervening with a young person, well then that imam and that community leader is going to say, I'd rather do nothing and just hope that nothing happens. That is when we all get into a problem. So the government and the community need to come together and agree on the terms of engagement with young people who are going down that path of violent extremism. That's the Safe Spaces Initiative in a nutshell. The living conditions for people who decide to go join ISIS, number one, what happens is that they go there thinking that they were going to find a safe haven, but they're actually recruited to be soldiers who will end up dying. So they're all going to end up dying at some point, unfortunately. These are lives of young people who have given up something, believing they're sacrificing their lives for a noble cause. Unfortunately, the reality is that they're sacrificing themselves for a very nefarious cause. Number two, the treatment of women is so terrifying that they take women who are captured from various towns and villages. And by the way, these are not just non-Muslim women, these are also Muslim women. And they create brothels where 15-year-old or even younger women are now drafted to be whores for these soldiers. And they tell these young men to go and have sex with these women, and that it is not only their right, but it is a religious obligation. This is not only inhumane, but this is against God. It's against the will of God. Because God represents good and justice and decency. What ISIS represents is evil and cruelty and slavery. So people will realize this stark reality when they get there. Unfortunately, what ISIS is using is advanced technological means to circulate social media, that this is that utopia that every Muslim is looking for, to find unity among Muslims. There is no unity, especially when you don't even know who the leader is. This guy who claims to be the leader of ISIS, Baghdadi, is not even seen. He's rarely heard from. So to have a leader who doesn't even show his face is not with the people, that in and of itself means that something is terribly wrong. And we have to expose the moral bankruptcy of ISIS. Once you go to ISIS, you cannot leave. It's like getting into the small intestine. You get in, but you can't get out. When people decide to join ISIS and they actually arrive to Syria or Iraq within ISIS territory, the chances of them getting out is very low. In other words, they're either going to die there, or they will leave, and when they come back home to the West, they'll be received with scrutiny, suspicion, surveillance, if not arrest, by the US government and other authorities. So going down the path of violent extremism means that it's going to end in a bad way. Either death or imprisonment, and not anything that you can find any redeeming value with. Well, I believe that American Muslims are actually in very good status and standing in American society. We are a minority. Our education within the community is very high, above average. Our income, average income for Muslim families is also above average. We have young people going in the best universities throughout the United States. We have professionals who are succeeding in business and science and now in the arts. So we're a thriving community here in the United States, more so than Muslims are in Europe. In Europe, they're treated as second-class citizens. In the United States, we are treated as equal citizens. The problem comes when we're dealing with the political sector. In other words, we are integrated socially and economically, but we have not been integrated in the political sector, in civic affairs. And so we're calling on our people to employ more civic engagement, to get involved, to be leaders in their community, to engage people, to promote truth over fear. And that all of America should see the remarks from presidential candidates that exploit the fear and hysteria from 9/11 to scapegoat American Muslims, to render that evil, to render that un-American, to render that actually backfiring on us as all Americans, going against American values. And if we can achieve that, if we can get some change in terms of the discourse on Islam and Muslims in America, then I think we've made progress. But that in and of itself is quite a tall order, because unfortunately politicians are weak and they don't say anything until they see a change in public opinion. And we have to work with civil society and with media to change public opinion, to show the reality that American Muslims are indeed thriving and contributing vitally to American society. There are Muslims in the armed forces. There are Muslims serving our government. There are Muslims who have made a declaration and an oath to serve the United States Constitution as members of Congress. So with that, we believe that in time, American Muslims will be seen for who they are, as lawful contributing members of American society, integral to the fabric of America, as well as vital to the success of America in the 21st century. If we want to change the status of American Muslims, it's not just the American Muslim that has to be involved in the change. It has to be Muslims with their fellow Americans doing it together. It has to be through engagement. It has to be for the betterment of society. And the more dialogue, the more understanding, and the more collaboration between American Muslims and fellow Americans, the better. I don't see any other way. Otherwise, American Muslims are just going to be another victim group, and we don't need more victims. People don't listen to victims. We have to frame it in a way that American Muslims and fellow Americans are working for justice for all, are working for better policies that are more effective in serving American interests, are working for showing how American Muslims are vital to the success of America. Violent extremism on the domestic front is an interesting topic, because the reality is there are more white militia violent extremists than there are Muslim violent extremists. Yet most of the attention and most of our tax dollars and most of government policy is designed to deal with the Muslim violent extremist. But when you think about how many terrorist incidents involved fatalities since 9/11, it's really a fraction, I think less than 10, involving Muslim violent extremists, as opposed to other violent extremists like white militia groups, which I believe now are approaching 100 or even more. So the disparity in the reality versus the perception and the policy framework is an interesting observation that we all must make. Number one, it's unjust to impose stigmatization and scrutiny and surveillance on any community. Number two, it's ineffective. Number three, when you do that, you're playing into the narrative that America is at war with Muslims. And ISIS wants nothing more than more propaganda to show to the rest of the Muslim world, I told you so, America is intolerant of Islam. That's a fallacy, that's a myth. But all of us Americans have to be involved in changing that myth and bringing truth. And we have to deal with our own fears first, our own misapprehensions. by learning about each other, by working together. With that collaboration, I believe that truth will overcome fear.